The woman who became rich by marrying a millionaire is suddenly forced to spend Thanksgiving with her poor family, who she kept at a distance. With her mother's passing, she has to spend time with them, but she was left speechless by what she found while going through her mother's belongings. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. Victoria Turner exuded an air of sophistication that made heads turn at every event. A tall, poised woman in her early 40s, she carried herself with the practiced grace of someone who had long mastered the art of social presence. Her lifestyle was a portrait of luxury: black tie galas, charity dinners where guests sipped champagne that cost more than most people's rent, and vacations in sun-drenched villas where the ocean was just a few paces from their door. She hadn't always lived like this. Growing up in Willow Creek, Victoria learned to dream big while sharing a tiny bedroom with her younger sister, Emma. Their mother worked tirelessly, balancing multiple jobs to keep food on the table and laughter in the air, even when times were tough. Ambitious and determined to create a life beyond the worn-out carpets and second-hand clothes, Victoria left for the city as soon as she turned 18, vowing never to look back. And for years, she didn't. Victoria met Thomas Turner at a charity auction, a place where stories of rags to riches often mingled with genuine philanthropy. Thomas was the epitome of charm with his tailored suits and easy smile. A self-made millionaire who built his empire from the ground up, he was sharp yet compassionate, a balance that fascinated her. He admired Victoria's ambition and sharp wit, qualities that matched his own relentless drive. Their courtship was swift, full of grand gestures, and shared evenings in private dining rooms overlooking the city skyline. Soon enough, they were married in an elegant ceremony, the kind that graced the society pages for weeks. Life as Mrs. Turner was glamorous. Days started with private yoga sessions and breakfast prepared by their chef, followed by meetings to coordinate her charitable involvements and long lunches at exclusive clubs. Nights meant dazzling gowns, glittering jewels, and Thomas at her side, his hand always warm on the small of her back as they charmed their way through crowds of power brokers and socialites. Though Thomas was deeply supportive, his work often kept him preoccupied. They shared moments of affection, whispers before bed, laughter over stories of the past, but their lives operated on parallel tracks, intersecting but not always entwined. One of the crowning jewels of Victoria's social life was her annual Thanksgiving Gala. It was no ordinary dinner, but a grand affair that rivaled the most exclusive events of the year. Held in their mansion's banquet hall, complete with ornate chandeliers and long, candlelit tables, the evening was curated to perfection. It was a night to remind everyone that the Turners' fortune wasn't just wealth, it was a lifestyle, an aspiration. Plans for this year's gala began months in advance. Victoria had already picked out an ensemble, a deep emerald dress that shimmered like polished jade, and selected a menu featuring dishes flown in from renowned chefs. Each centerpiece was custom-ordered, designed to evoke an air of effortless elegance. Lists and reminders piled up on her mahogany desk, and her assistant, Janine, checked in regularly to confirm each detail. But on one unremarkable afternoon, as she reviewed seating charts, her phone buzzed. The name on the screen, Emma. They hadn't spoken in months, their conversation stilted and peppered with the strain of old wounds. Victoria, Emma's voice cracked on the other end. It's about Mom. She's gone. The world around Victoria shifted, colors muted, sounds muffled as if the room itself had drawn a sharp breath. Gone. The word settled in her chest like a weight, pressing against her ribs. For a long moment, she couldn't speak, couldn't move. The image of her mother, vibrant even amidst her struggles, flashed in her mind, stirring a guilt she hadn't let herself feel in years. Emma's voice softened. The funeral, we need you here. As soon as the call ended, conflicting emotions surged. The carefully constructed life she'd built, designed to keep the past at arm's length, suddenly felt like it might shatter. What would people think if she cancelled the event? The gala wasn't just a party, it was an emblem of her status, a testament to what she had made of herself. Yet, there was something deeper, a longing buried under years of avoidance, that urged her to go home. That evening, she stood in her walk-in closet, surrounded by gowns, designer heels, and accessories that once symbolized her triumph. But for the first time, they felt hollow, like a collection of masks hiding something raw and unpolished beneath. Thomas found her there, still holding the emerald dress she'd planned to wear. His brows knitted with concern. "Victoria, what's wrong?" he asked, taking her hand. "I have to go to Willow Creek," she whispered. The sound of those words unsettled her, breaking a silence she'd kept for so long. "Mom passed away." Thomas's face shifted, softening with understanding. "Then you need to be with your family." The simplicity of his statement pierced through the noise in her mind. This wasn't a decision about public perception or social obligation. It was about family, the kind that could not be replaced by the grandeur of marble floors or glittering chandeliers. She nodded, determination lining her face as she called Janine to cancel the gala. "Yes, the entire event," she said, voice steadier now. She ignored Janine's stammered protests. "Thank you for your understanding." As she ended the call, Victoria felt the mansion grow quiet around her, as if holding its breath. The drive into Willow Creek was a slow unraveling of memories Victoria hadn't allowed herself to touch. Trees, still clinging to their last golden leaves, lined the narrow road, and the houses grew smaller, cozier, as she neared the heart of town. The familiar creak of the brakes as she stopped outside her childhood home made her hands tighten on the steering wheel. It looked the same, white paint peeling at the corners, the porch slightly tilted, and the wind chime her mother adored clinking softly in the crisp air. Before she could steel herself, the front door opened. Emma stood there, her auburn hair swept back into a messy ponytail, eyes as sharp and kind as Victoria remembered. Behind her, Alex and Sam loomed, their expressions a complicated mix of relief and apprehension. For a moment, silence settled, heavy and awkward. Then Emma stepped forward and pulled Victoria into a hug that was both warm and distant, like a blanket pulled too thin. "Glad you made it," Emma whispered, releasing her with a tentative smile. The brothers nodded their hellos, their eyes darting to the pristine coat and polished heels that seemed foreign on this patch of earth. Victoria stepped inside, and the scent of cinnamon and old wood washed over her, bringing with it memories that pricked at her heart. The small entryway led into a living room filled with faded floral curtains, mismatched chairs, and a coffee table scarred by years of use. The walls were a collage of moments, photos of birthday parties with icing-streaked smiles, school recitals, and family vacations where laughter had outshone their struggles. "Wow, nothing's changed," she murmured, half to herself. Alex let out a dry chuckle. "Not all of us can afford to redecorate every year," he said, a hint of bitterness slipping through his casual tone. Emma shot him a look, but Victoria only nodded, taking the jab in stride. They gathered in the living room, where the couch sank a little too much under the weight of time. Victoria sat carefully, her coat draped like an invisible shield around her. Emma offered her a mug of instant coffee, and Victoria accepted it, the warm ceramic grounding her as she took a small sip. It tasted sharp and familiar, the kind of coffee her mother used to make, always a bit too strong, but bracing in its simplicity. The initial conversations stumbled over themselves, small talk that danced around the reality they all faced. Sam, always the peacemaker, broke the silence with stories about his 2 kids, showing photos of their gap-toothed grins and messy hair. Emma spoke about her teaching job, her eyes lighting up when she described the school's art fair. Alex kept mostly to himself, arms crossed as he leaned against the worn-out armchair, studying Victoria with a gaze that felt like a question she wasn't ready to answer. It wasn't just the noise of the room that unsettled her, it was the way the walls seemed to lean in, pressing memories from every corner. The frayed rug beneath her feet was the same one she and Emma had sprawled across during countless game nights, and the old clock on the mantel still ticked unevenly, a background soundtrack to their childhood. It was as if the house itself was trying to remind her who she used to be, making her designer clothes feel like armor that didn't quite fit. Emma sighed, breaking Victoria's reverie. "It's strange, isn't it? Being here without her," she said softly. The words hung in the air, tender and raw, and for a moment, they all shared the quiet grief that had woven itself into the room. Victoria nodded, eyes tracing the edges of a framed photo on the mantel. It was an old one, their mother in the middle, laughing so hard her eyes crinkled at the corners, arms around all 4 children. The warmth in that memory was almost tangible, but it was dulled now, wrapped in the ache of what they had lost. "Yeah," Victoria finally said, her voice catching. She looked up at her siblings, who exchanged glances, hesitant and searching. It wasn't just grief making the air feel heavy, it was the years of distance, the silent accusations buried beneath polite smiles. I wish I'd been here more," she said, the confession falling between them like a fragile thing. Alex shifted, his jaw tightening as if to hold back a retort. Emma's eyes softened, but she didn't reach out. It was Sam who broke the tension with a small nod, acknowledging the effort, if nothing else. "Well, you're here now," he said, not unkindly, but with an edge that spoke of realities that couldn't be undone. Victoria set her mug down, suddenly feeling exposed. She stood up and walked to the window, the view of the small yard dotted with leaves, and the fence that had weathered too many storms. The sound of children playing next door filtered in, unbothered by the weight inside the house. The conversation resumed, tiptoeing around their mother's absence and sliding back into memories, stories that pulled out strained chuckles and short-lived smiles. Victoria joined in hesitantly, her laughter thin at first, but growing a little more real as the minutes passed. She listened to Emma talk about how their mother always burned the first batch of Thanksgiving rolls, and how Sam and Alex would compete to see who could sneak the most slices of turkey before dinner. The house felt different now, like it was waiting for her to acknowledge something she hadn't been ready to face. The first night back, Victoria lay on her childhood bed, staring at the ceiling that had been repainted so many times it was impossible to remember its original color. The mattress was thin and creaked under her slightest movement, as if conspiring with the night to remind her of where she was. The city's plush, pillow-topped bed seemed like a distant dream, and she shifted uncomfortably, feeling every spring jab into her back. When the clock on the wall struck midnight with a metallic clang, she flinched, letting out a breathy laugh. "Welcome home," she muttered to herself, rolling over in defeat. The next morning was a chaotic ballet of sounds and smells. The aroma of bacon and toast wafted through the house as the faint sound of an old radio crackled from the kitchen. Victoria, still adjusting to the morning chill, stumbled into the kitchen wrapped in a borrowed robe that smelled faintly of lavender and old detergent. She was met with a scene that made her pause, Emma and Sam wrestling with a particularly stubborn toaster while Alex sipped coffee, smirking at their misfortune. "Well, look who's finally up," Alex teased, lifting his mug in a mock toast. "City life must have made you soft." Victoria rolled her eyes, suppressing a smile as she reached for a mismatched mug that read "World's Best Mom" in faded letters. She poured herself a cup of instant coffee, cringing after the first sip. The taste was sharp, acidic, nothing like the rich, foamy lattes she was used to. Still, there was something oddly grounding about it, as if the simplicity of the moment tethered her to a different time. Emma glanced over, eyes sparkling with mischief. "Careful, Vic, you look like you're about to pass out from shock. Don't tell me the coffee here isn't up to your standards." Victoria laughed despite herself. "I don't know how you drink this," she admitted, shaking her head. Sam leaned over and poured a splash of cream into her mug with a knowing grin. "Trust me, you'll get used to it," he said. "Or at least stop complaining about it by day 3. The day unfolded with a mix of banter and mishaps. While clearing out a cabinet, Victoria reached for a plate, only for the entire stack to teeter dangerously before clattering onto the counter with a cacophony of ceramic dings. Emma's eyes widened, and then, without missing a beat, burst into laughter. "Still got those butterfingers, huh?" Victoria tried to scowl, but couldn't hold back her own laugh. "At least I didn't break any," she said, holding up the unscathed plate triumphantly. Lunch preparation was its own comedy show. Victoria decided to help peel potatoes, her well-manicured nails a glaring mismatch against the dull, rusted peeler. After a few uneven slices and a yelp as a piece of potato went flying across the room, Alex couldn't hold back. "Vic, why don't you let someone else handle that before we lose more vegetables, or fingers," he said, plucking the peeler from her hands. "Fine," Victoria huffed, half amused, half exasperated. She watched as Sam expertly peeled in long, smooth strokes, the kind of ease born from practice. She felt a strange pang, a mix of nostalgia and longing for the familiarity they seemed to share effortlessly. "All right, since I'm clearly a hazard, what else can I do?" she asked with mock defeat. Emma, drying her hands on a dish towel, handed Victoria a bowl of carrots. "Chop these, but please, try not to make them fly." They all fell into a rhythm, punctuated by light-hearted teasing. Victoria found herself genuinely smiling, her usual mask of poise slipping away with each joke and shared glance. When she clumsily chopped a carrot so thick it rolled off the counter, Sam snorted, "And this is why we don't let you cook, Your Highness." "Oh, don't start, or I'll find a way to make you do all the dishes," Victoria shot back, feigning indignation. For a second, the room stilled, and then laughter erupted, warm and binding. It felt like an old tune they all knew by heart but hadn't sung in years. Later that afternoon, Victoria sat by the window, sipping her now slightly more tolerable instant coffee. Outside, the lawn was dotted with fallen leaves, and Sam's kids played tag, their giggles filling the air. She felt a slight soreness in her hands from the morning's clumsy attempts at cooking and smiled faintly, flexing her fingers. The polish on her nails was chipped, a casualty of the kitchen chaos, but she didn't mind as much as she thought she would. Emma joined her at the window, leaning on the frame. "You're different here, you know," she said, not looking at Victoria but at the scene outside. Victoria turned, caught off guard. "Different how?" Emma shrugged. "Less polished. More like you used to be." She glanced at her sister, eyes searching. "It's nice to see." A warmth spread in Victoria's chest, unexpected and bittersweet. "Yeah, I think I missed this," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. They stood there for a moment longer, letting the day's noise fill the spaces between them. The rest of the afternoon carried on with moments that wove themselves into new memories, Emma teaching Victoria how to knead dough properly, "No, not like you're afraid of it," Alex pretending to critique her technique with exaggerated seriousness, and Sam pulling out their mother's old recipe book, its pages marked with notes in familiar, looping handwriting. The morning sun spilled through the thin curtains, casting warm, dappled light onto the living room floor. Boxes and piles of their mother's things were scattered around, a jumble of memories waiting to be sorted. Victoria sat cross-legged on the worn rug, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, sleeves rolled up in preparation for the emotional excavation ahead. Emma kneeled nearby, already sifting through a stack of old magazines, while Alex and Sam took turns flipping through old photo albums and sorting the kitchenware into keep, donate, and toss piles. "Look at this," Alex said, holding up a photograph that was starting to curl at the edges. It showed their mother in her 30s, hair wild and smile wide as she held a squirming toddler, Victoria. The room filled with a soft chorus of chuckles. "Even then, you had that 'don't mess with me' look," Sam teased, pointing to Victoria's tiny frown. She smirked, taking the photo from Alex and running her fingers over the surface. "I was probably mad you stole my snack," she shot back, earning a mock-offended gasp from Sam. Emma pulled out a small wooden box, its once glossy finish worn from years of handling. I remember this, she said, flipping it open to reveal a pile of handwritten letters and small trinkets, a delicate hairpin, a dried four-leaf clover, and tiny folded notes that their mother had used to tuck into their lunchboxes. Victoria's eyes lingered on a piece of paper that was barely legible now, smudged from time, but still carrying their mother's familiar script. Have a great day, my loves. Remember, you're braver than you think. Emma read aloud, her voice catching at the end. The room grew quiet, each of them pulled into their own pocket of memory. For a moment, the air was heavy with unspoken thoughts, and Victoria's chest tightened. Sam broke the silence with a low whistle. Mom had a way of making even the simplest things feel special, he said, picking up the four-leaf clover. Remember how she convinced us these would protect us from nightmares? Victoria smiled, a tender ache blooming in her heart. I still have one pressed in an old book somewhere, she admitted softly. It was true, hidden among luxury and ambition was a reminder of nights when their mother's stories were the only armor they needed. Hours passed, marked by bursts of laughter and wistful silences. Each item they unearthed seemed to bring back another story, a ripple in the vast lake of their shared history. A broken Christmas ornament led to the tale of the year the tree toppled over because Sam tried to climb it, and a cookbook with greasy pages reminded them of countless Sunday afternoons filled with the scent of cinnamon and loud debates over whose recipe was better. Victoria picked up an old record, its cover cracked, but the title still visible. It was their mother's favorite, an album she'd play while cooking, dancing through the small kitchen with a spoon in hand. Without thinking, Victoria put it on the turntable that sat by the window. The needle crackled before the familiar tune floated through the room, weaving its way around them like a warm embrace. Emma laughed, eyes sparkling. I can't believe you remembered that old thing even works. Victoria shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. Some things you don't forget. Alex started swaying dramatically to the music, making the others laugh until Emma threw a balled-up napkin at him. The room lit up with a glow that had been absent for too long. For a while, it was easy to forget the reasons they were there, wrapped up instead in moments that made the past feel close enough to touch. As the music continued, Victoria's hand fell on a faded shoebox at the bottom of a larger bin. Lifting it out, she hesitated before removing the lid. Inside was a collection of old board game pieces, a few dice, and score sheets with tallies scrawled in messy handwriting. She felt a rush of childhood nights spent sprawled out on that very rug, accusing each other of cheating and laughing so hard they'd get scolded for making too much noise past bedtime. Hey, look at this, she said, showing the others. Their reactions ranged from Sam's playful groan, "Not that game again," to Emma's knowing grin. We never finished a game without someone flipping the board, Alex added, leaning back with a chuckle. Usually you, Vic. She feigned shock. I was passionate. The lightheartedness turned thoughtful as they began sharing memories that layered on top of each other, rich with details they'd long forgotten. Victoria felt the familiar distance she maintained start to blur, edges softening as the weight of the past mingled with the comfort of the present. Reaching the bottom of the shoebox, her fingers brushed against a small, hand-sewn beanbag. A rush of warmth flooded her as she lifted it up. Their mother had made one for each of them, stitching them from old scraps of fabric and filling them with beans to teach them how to juggle. The memory was vivid, laughter and failed attempts, their mother clapping enthusiastically even when they dropped them one after another. You remember these? Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room quieted, the nostalgia shared without words. Emma nodded, taking one of the beanbags and tossing it lightly in the air. I think this was the first time we learned it was okay to mess up, Emma said, catching it on its way down. Mom always said it was part of the fun. Victoria swallowed, the warmth in her chest mingling with the bittersweet sting of loss. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Sam smiling at her, his usual teasing absent for the moment. Funny, isn't it? The things you forget and the things you never really let go of, he said. Victoria nodded, letting the silence that followed feel less like emptiness and more like a bridge to something real, something she hadn't realized she needed. The weight of the past, once so daunting, now seemed lighter, shared between them. And in that simple moment, surrounded by the remnants of their mother's love, Victoria understood that she hadn't just returned to help, she had come back to be reminded. As the day stretched into late afternoon, the light spilling through the window shifted from golden to a softer, deeper hue. Victoria's hand brushed against the back of a cabinet as she moved an old quilt aside, and her fingers hit something cool and metallic. Intrigued, she pushed the blanket away and uncovered a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was locked, the brass latch dulled with age, but still sturdy. A rush of curiosity mingled with a strange sense of dread coursed through her. This wasn't just any trinket, it was something hidden, something private. "Hey, what's that?" Emma's voice broke through the quiet hum of the house. She set down a stack of cookbooks and moved closer, eyes narrowing with recognition. Alex and Sam, sensing the change in atmosphere, stopped their sorting and exchanged glances. Victoria's heart thumped as she studied the carvings, a pattern she hadn't seen since she was a child. "It's Dad's," she said, voice thick. She remembered watching him whittle the edges during long winter nights, his hands skilled and quick, always crafting something small for them while he hummed an old tune. Alex crossed his arms, expression guarded. "It's been there all these years?" he asked, disbelief lacing his words. With a steady hand, Victoria flipped open the latch. It clicked easily, as though it had just been waiting for her touch. Inside, a bundle of neatly folded letters sat, tied together with a thin blue ribbon that had frayed at the edges. The handwriting on the envelopes was immediately recognizable. Victoria's breath caught. Her father's script was distinctive, slanted, bold, as if each word carried weight. She untied the ribbon, fingers trembling, and opened the top letter. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were clear enough. "My dearest Victoria, if you're reading this, it means I still haven't found a way back to you." A sharp gasp escaped her, and she looked up, eyes brimming with confusion and something else, hope, perhaps. Emma's face fell, eyes widening as she read over Victoria's shoulder. Sam leaned in, brow furrowed, while Alex stood rigid, jaw tight as if bracing for impact. They read through a few more letters, each one a small window into their father's yearning, filled with stories of his attempts to reconnect, to explain, and to bridge the chasm that had widened after he left. He wrote about obstacles Victoria hadn't known existed, complicated family pressures and decisions made out of desperation rather than indifference. "But why didn't Mom tell us any of this?" Emma's voice was strained, caught between disbelief and grief. The letters painted a picture that clashed with everything they'd been told, reshaping their understanding of a man they'd spent years resenting. Victoria folded one of the letters, her eyes meeting Alex's. "We need to know why she kept this from us," she said, not as a demand but as a truth that couldn't be ignored. Alex shifted, the tension in his stance hardening. "What's the point, Vic? He's gone, and so is Mom. This doesn't change anything." "It changes everything," Victoria insisted, her voice rising. She turned to Emma and Sam, searching their faces for agreement, for validation. Emma's expression softened, torn but understanding, while Sam avoided her gaze, staring instead at the box as if it might offer answers of its own. "Maybe she had her reasons," Sam said quietly, breaking the silence. "Mom always did what she thought was best." "But was it?" Victoria pressed. "Or was she protecting us from something that could have been fixed?" Tension simmered, the room filling with a kind of silent debate only siblings could share, where words carried weight and pauses spoke volumes. Emma placed a hand on Victoria's arm, a touch that was more grounding than comforting. "We can't change the past," Emma said, eyes meeting hers. "But if you need to know more, we'll help you." Alex sighed, finally relenting with a resigned nod. "Don't drag us back into something that took us years to move on from," he warned, though his tone was softer now. tinged with concern rather than anger. Victoria felt a mixture of gratitude and resolve. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surrounded by family, she was connected to them, tied by the same questions and echoes of memories that hadn't been properly laid to rest. That evening, after the box had been closed and set aside, Victoria sat alone in the kitchen, the faint sound of crickets drifting through the open window. The letters were tucked into her pocket, their words echoing in her mind. She knew what she had to do next: follow the trail her father had left, no matter how faint. The door creaked as Sam entered, breaking her solitude. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed and face unreadable. "You really think finding out will help?" he asked, not accusing, just curious. Victoria met his eyes, the weight of her decision clear in her gaze. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I need to try." He nodded once, a small show of support, then moved to make a fresh pot of coffee. The familiar smell filled the room, mingling with the weight of the letters and the questions they carried. For the first time since she'd arrived, the quiet didn't feel lonely, it felt full of possibility. The crisp morning air carried a chill that seemed to settle in Victoria's bones as she walked through Willow Creek, her heart a mix of nerves and resolve. She clutched a thin scarf around her neck, eyes darting to familiar landmarks that felt simultaneously close and distant. The letters were now an anchor in her mind, urging her to follow threads she'd long believed cut. She approached the first name on her mental list, Mrs. Langley, their neighbor from years ago, who still lived in the same stone-front house with ivy creeping up its sides. Victoria knocked, the sound hesitant but determined. A few moments later, the door opened to reveal Mrs. Langley, now hunched with age, but still possessing sharp eyes that missed little. "Victoria Turner," the old woman said, her smile carrying warmth and surprise. "I thought I'd never see you again." She ushered Victoria inside, offering a seat by the window where light spilled generously over the threadbare armchairs. "Mrs. Langley, I'm looking for answers about my father," Victoria began, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her coat. "I found letters he wrote." "Did you ever see him after he left?" Mrs. Langley's eyes softened, a blend of recognition and sadness. "Oh, child. Yes, I did. He came back many times, always lingering by your house, just out of sight. It was like he wanted to come in but couldn't bring himself to." She paused, the memory washing over her. "He'd sit on that bench across the street, especially on birthdays. Your mother, she knew. I think she couldn't bear to tell you." The weight of the revelation pressed against Victoria's chest. The idea of her father, so close yet so unreachable, was both painful and inexplicably hopeful. She reached out, squeezing Mrs. Langley's hand in silent gratitude before leaving to chase the fragile lead. The next stop was the cafe at the heart of town, where she hoped to gather more whispers of information. It was a small, bustling place where the scent of fresh pastries mixed with the low hum of chatter. As she sat at a corner table, nursing a cup of tea, a man with graying hair and kind eyes approached. "Victoria Turner, right?" he asked, the familiarity in his tone surprising her. He was someone she didn't recognize, but he carried the ease of someone who knew more than a stranger should. "I used to work with your dad. I'd see him sometimes at the community center." Victoria leaned forward, hope sparking in her eyes. "Did he mention anything about wanting to come back to us?" The man nodded, eyes shadowed by memory. "He did. Said he regretted staying away but thought it was for your best. He's been working at the retirement home on Oak Street, helping out part-time. Still sharp, even if time's taken its toll." The words hit her like a jolt of electricity. Her father wasn't just a shadow of the past, he was here, alive, just blocks away. The room blurred as she stood, muttering a quick thank you and rushing out, the street a blur as she hurried to the address the man had given. The retirement home was modest, the kind that spoke more of necessity than luxury. Victoria paused just outside the entrance, pressing a hand to her chest to steady the rush of nerves and anticipation. The chatter of staff and visitors filled the hallway as she stepped inside, scanning for any sign of him. "Can I help you?" a nurse asked, eyeing her with polite curiosity. "I'm looking for a man who volunteers here, tall, with gray hair and blue eyes." Victoria's voice was barely steady. The nurse's expression softened. "You mean Mr. Turner? He's in the garden, reading to some of the residents." Each step down the hall felt like an eternity. The garden door creaked as she opened it, revealing a small courtyard dotted with benches and potted plants. And there he was. The years had etched lines into his face, but he stood tall, the same confident posture she remembered from childhood. He was reading aloud from a worn book, voice steady and warm, eyes lit with an old spark that was unmistakably him. "Dad," she whispered, the word breaking free before she could stop it. He paused mid-sentence, eyes lifting and finding her instantly. Recognition flashed, followed by shock, then something deeper, relief mixed with raw emotion. He set the book down, hands trembling as he took a tentative step forward. The space between them seemed both vast and intimate, filled with all the years and words they hadn't shared. "Victoria," he said, voice thick with disbelief and joy. He reached out, and she met him halfway, the years collapsing in the space of a breath as she wrapped her arms around him. The moment was fragile, both of them holding on as if to make sure it was real. "I found your letters," she said, tears gathering in her eyes. "Why didn't you come back? Why didn't you tell us?" He sighed, the weight of old choices pressing on him. "I thought staying away was protecting you. Your mother, she believed it was best for you all. And maybe, for a while, I convinced myself she was right." The quiet of the garden wrapped around them, carrying a sense of understanding that words alone couldn't express. Victoria felt her father's fingers tighten, the strength of his grip telling her he wouldn't let go again. "We missed you," she said softly, her voice breaking as she met his eyes, which mirrored her own in their watery sheen. "And I missed all of you, more than you could ever know," he whispered, a tear escaping down the weathered path of his cheek. They stood together as the late afternoon sun cast warm light over the garden, finally filling the spaces between them that had once seemed insurmountable. The drive back to the family home was quiet, but not tense. Victoria's father sat beside her, glancing at the passing scenery with eyes that looked both older and lighter. He hadn't been in that car in years, yet it felt like he belonged there, as if he were reclaiming a place that had always been waiting. "I almost didn't recognize this town," he said, breaking the silence with a small chuckle. "It's grown so much." Victoria smiled, hands gripping the wheel. "And yet, some things never change," she replied, nodding toward the old diner on the corner where they'd once shared milkshakes after school. When they pulled up to the house, the front door opened, and Emma stepped out, eyes wide. Sam and Alex appeared behind her, drawn by the sound of tires on gravel. The air seemed to hold its breath as they took in the man stepping out of the car, a figure long relegated to dusty photographs and faded memories. "Dad?" Sam's voice was a mix of disbelief and hope, wavering as if he were testing the word. Their father nodded, eyes shimmering as he approached. "It's me, son," he said, voice steady but thick with emotion. Before another word could be spoken, Emma launched herself forward, arms wrapping tightly around him. Sam joined a beat later, and finally Alex, whose expression softened as he clapped his father's back, holding on longer than he intended. "I'm sorry," their father whispered, eyes closing as the past and present collided in a wave of emotion. "I'm so sorry for staying away." They pulled back, wiping at their eyes and catching their breath. Victoria stood to the side, taking in the scene with a smile that trembled on the edges. The house seemed to hum with a new energy, walls once marked by loss, now echoing with reunion. Once inside, Emma made tea, filling cups with shaky hands. They settled around the living room, the space suddenly alive with stories waiting to be told. Their father took a deep breath, eyes moving between his children, each face a reflection of years he'd missed. "I owe you the truth," he began. Your mother and we were complicated. When the business fell apart, I felt like I'd let everyone down. But it wasn't just pride keeping me away. He paused, eyes shadowed by the weight of old decisions. Your mother's family pressured her, convinced her that it was better if I kept my distance until I could stand on my own again. By the time I could, so much time had passed, and I feared what coming back might do. Sam rubbed the back of his neck, processing the pieces of the story that now fit where holes once were. Emma's eyes shone with unshed tears, while Alex leaned forward, elbows on his knees, listening intently. You watched us, didn't you? Victoria asked softly, recalling Mrs. Langley's words. He nodded. I never stopped watching over you. On birthdays, holidays. I just couldn't come closer. The guilt, the fear, it's no excuse, but it's the truth. The room was silent for a moment before Alex broke it with a quiet laugh, one that grew louder as he spoke. Remember how we used to make fun of the man who sat on the park bench all the time? We called him Mr. Mystery. Their father's eyes widened in surprise, and then a soft chuckle escaped him. That was me. Watching and wishing. Laughter bubbled up, tinged with tears but real. It rolled through the room, a sound that hadn't graced the old house in far too long. The tension that had wrapped around their hearts began to loosen, replaced by the tentative warmth of shared understanding. As the evening waned, stories flowed freely. Sam brought out an old board game, setting it up with the same practiced moves he'd used since they were kids. Their father smiled, recalling how he used to let them win, much to Alex's delight and Victoria's chagrin. I'm still going to beat you, Victoria teased, nudging her father as they sat down at the table. Oh, I remember your tricks, he said, eyes twinkling. You were always the most competitive. The game was filled with playful accusations and bursts of laughter, with Emma nearly tipping the board when Sam pretended to cheat. Victoria glanced around the table, noting the way her father's face brightened when he laughed, the familiar crinkle at the corner of his eyes, the same crinkle she saw in her own reflection. I guess we know where we got our stubborn streak, Alex said, pointing at Victoria, then back at their father. Guilty as charged, their father admitted with a grin. And your knack for interrupting people mid-sentence, Emma, that's all me. The room erupted again, the sound of their voices carrying far beyond the walls, as if reaching out to reclaim all the moments they thought they'd lost. When the game ended, and the board lay scattered with pieces in a jumble, Victoria realized that the emptiness she had carried for years was starting to fill, bit by bit. As the evening drew to a close, Sam stood up, stretching. Tomorrow, we'll go through Mom's garden, he said. She'd want you to see it. Their father's eyes grew misty, but he nodded. I'd like that. Victoria leaned back, watching as Emma yawned and Alex began collecting the game pieces. The house felt different now, not just a space defined by memories, but a place holding hope for what came next. She caught her father's eye, and they shared a smile that needed no words. For tonight, it was enough to be here, surrounded by laughter and forgiveness. The house buzzed with energy as the family prepared for Thanksgiving, a day that seemed to hold more meaning this year. The kitchen was a swirl of activity, filled with the rich scents of spices and roasting vegetables. Sam was chopping onions with theatrical flair, tears streaming down his face as he joked about winning an award for most dramatic chef. Emma bustled by, balancing a bowl of cranberry sauce and a timer set for the turkey, while Alex worked on perfecting a gravy recipe that only he insisted needed a touch more pepper. Victoria stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, staring at a large pot of potatoes waiting to be mashed. The challenge was clear, no luxury kitchen gadgets, no shortcuts, just her, a simple masher, and a task she hadn't tackled in years. She glanced over to her father, who was carefully assembling a pumpkin pie crust with the same patience he used when teaching them card tricks as kids. He caught her eye and smiled, a quiet look that said, "You've got this." "Are we sure letting Vic handle the potatoes is a good idea?" Alex teased, leaning against the counter, mock suspicion in his voice. Careful, or you're on dish duty, Victoria shot back, smirking as she picked up the masher and dug in. The kitchen filled with the rhythmic sound of her effort, each press punctuated by laughter as Emma joined in with playful commentary. Remember when Mom used to make mashed potatoes so fluffy, we'd fight over who got the first scoop? Emma said, pausing for a moment to wipe her hands on a dish towel. Yeah, and she'd always sneak a spoonful before bringing it to the table, Sam added, his smile softening with nostalgia. Dad would pretend not to notice, Victoria said, glancing at their father, who looked up, eyes twinkling. He chuckled, shaking his head. She was convinced her secret taste tests were unnoticed, he said, voice thick with affection. The room quieted for a beat, not out of sadness, but respect for the memory of a woman who still felt present in every corner of the house. Soon, the chaos of the kitchen turned into an organized dance, each sibling moving with an ease that spoke of old routines rediscovered. Victoria finished mashing the potatoes, tasting them and adding a pinch of salt as Alex passed by, raising his eyebrows with a surprised nod of approval. Emma put the final touches on a platter of roasted vegetables, their vibrant colors a contrast to the browns and golds of the turkey and stuffing. When everything was ready, they gathered around the dining table, now set with mismatched plates and a centerpiece made of autumn leaves and candles. The warm glow softened the room, casting light on faces that were relaxed, eyes reflecting years of shared moments and new beginnings. Their father took a seat at the head of the table, a place he hadn't occupied in decades, and the significance wasn't lost on any of them. Victoria raised her glass, a hint of nerves fluttering in her chest. Before we eat, I just want to say how grateful I am that we're all here. This year has brought back memories, some painful, but it's also brought us back together. She looked at each of her siblings, then turned to her father, who watched her with pride. To family, Emma said, lifting her own glass, her voice strong but emotional. To family, the others echoed, clinking glasses before settling into their chairs. The first bites were taken with sighs of approval and murmurs of "this is amazing," and "pass the potatoes," before Sam eats them all. As dinner unfolded, the room filled with stories. Their father recounted tales of their mother's knack for turning every challenge into a moment of love and determination. He spoke of the times he'd watched them grow from a distance, how it felt to see them laugh and play, even when he wasn't close enough to join in. The stories were bittersweet, but they felt like the missing pieces they hadn't known they needed. I wish she could see us now, Emma said, eyes glistening as she glanced at the empty chair that once belonged to their mother. I think she would be proud, Sam added, a smile breaking through his solemn expression. As dessert was served and the pumpkin pie made its way around the table, Victoria stood again, clearing her throat. The clinking of forks paused, and all eyes turned to her. There's one more thing I wanted to share, she began, voice steady but edged with excitement. I've been thinking about how much this town meant to Mom and how she gave so much of herself to help others. I want to renovate the community center in her memory, create a space that reflects her spirit and the way she touched everyone's lives. A collective intake of breath followed. Emma's hand flew to her mouth, and Sam's expression shifted to one of astonished pride. Even Alex, who often masked his emotions with humor, looked genuinely moved. That's incredible, their father said, voice barely above a whisper. His eyes shone, and he reached for Victoria's hand, squeezing it tightly. She'd love that. I'll need your help, Victoria continued, looking at each of them. We'll make it a place where stories like ours can start, where people feel seen and supported, just like Mom would have wanted. Laughter mixed with happy tears as plans started forming around the table. Emma volunteered to organize art projects, Sam promised to rally the local sports teams for fundraising, and Alex, with a grin, claimed he'd handle the budget and make sure no one went overboard. The meal wound down, and conversation turned light, filled with teasing and plans for tomorrow's leftovers. Victoria sat back, soaking in the warmth and the sense of wholeness that had settled over them. She glanced out the window, the stars blinking softly in the deepening night, and felt a peace she hadn't known she was searching for. Victoria felt a flutter of excitement and nerves as she unlocked the front door to her mansion. The grand foyer stretched out before her, gleaming marble floors reflecting the crystal chandelier that hung like a crown above them. As she walked in, the sound of the car door slamming behind her was followed by a mix of gasps and laughter. Her siblings and father stood at the entrance, eyes wide with wonder and disbelief. "Is this a house or a spaceship?" her father muttered, half to himself, eyebrows raised as he took in the modern, polished interior. The automatic lights flickered on as they stepped inside, causing Emma to jump back with a surprised yelp. "Whoa! Did the lights just turn on by themselves?" Emma said, her laughter cutting through the initial awe. Sam walked past her, inspecting a vase that stood taller than he was, while Alex, ever the skeptic, poked at a nearby panel until a robotic voice said, "Welcome home, Victoria." "Okay, that's both cool and creepy," Alex said, taking a step back as the voice faded. Victoria couldn't help but laugh, a sound that felt lighter than it had in years. "You'll get used to it," she said, shrugging. The walls seemed to echo with warmth rather than emptiness for once, filled with the familiar sounds of her family's chatter. They moved further into the house, exploring with a mix of awe and mischief. Emma found the high-tech kitchen first, her eyes going wide as she spotted the stainless steel appliances and the seamless countertop that looked untouched by a single crumb. "Victoria, how do you even use half of this stuff?" Emma teased, running her finger along the edge of an espresso machine that looked more like a command center. Victoria grinned, leaning against the island. "That's what the chef's for," she said playfully, earning an exaggerated gasp from Alex. "Of course, she has a chef," he said, shaking his head with a laugh. He tugged on one of the pristine dish towels hanging from a rack, only to pause. "Wait, are these decorative towels? Can I actually use these?" Sam wandered over to the fridge, its sleek doors a testament to modern design. He pulled at the handle, only for an alarm to blare briefly, startling everyone. He raised his hands defensively. "I swear, I was just checking for snacks." The alarm cut off, leaving them in stunned silence that quickly melted into laughter. Their father stood nearby, eyes full of amusement as he watched his children stumble through this strange, lavish world. "I think I need instructions just to use the bathroom," he said, rubbing his chin as Victoria guided them further into the house. As they settled in, the house that usually felt too large, too quiet, was alive with noise. Victoria felt her heart swell watching Emma poke at the smart home system, making it adjust the curtains and change the temperature. Alex leaned against a massive, custom couch, eyeing the enormous TV that spanned the length of the wall. Sam found a remote and, with a grin, pressed a button that made a hidden shelf rotate, revealing a small minibar. "Oh, this is dangerous," he said, winking at Victoria. "Please, just don't press any more buttons," she joked, feeling a familiar, easy happiness seep into her. Later that night, they gathered in the grand living room, the fireplace crackling and casting a warm glow across the room. The usual formality of the space was replaced with cozy blankets and half-empty mugs of cocoa. Their father sat back in an oversized armchair, a wistful look in his eyes as he glanced around. "I never imagined one of my kids would live in a place like this," he said softly, pride and awe mingling in his voice. "Your mother would have loved to see this, Vic. She always said you'd go far." Victoria felt a lump rise in her throat. The mansion had always been a symbol of her success, but hearing her father's words shifted something in her. It wasn't just about the marble and chandeliers, it was about what they represented, how far she'd come, and how far she still needed to go to reconnect with what truly mattered. Emma leaned forward, eyes warm with understanding. "Mom would have loved this, but she'd probably have a heart attack trying to figure out those voice-activated lights," she said, breaking the tender moment with a laugh that rippled through the room. Alex, always one for grounding moments with humor, added, and she'd scold you for having towels you can't use. They laughed, the sound comfortable and real. Victoria looked around, seeing how the space transformed under their presence. It felt less like a showpiece and more like a home, at least for tonight. "Thanks for letting us see your world, Vic," Sam said, raising his mug in a toast. "It's different, but it's still you." Victoria nodded, catching each of their eyes. "It's nice to have you all here. I forget sometimes that it's not the place that makes a home, it's who you share it with." Their father, who had been quietly observing, leaned forward, voice gentle but clear. "Just don't forget what keeps you grounded, Victoria. This place is beautiful, but it's your heart and who you are with your family that matters most." The room fell silent for a moment, not out of discomfort but a shared understanding. Victoria felt the truth settle deep within her. The grandeur around them was a part of her life, but it wasn't the only part. The laughter, the playful teasing, and the stories shared tonight were what she'd been missing. They stayed up long into the night, recounting stories that ranged from light-hearted to bittersweet. Their father shared tales of her mother's stubborn optimism and how she never let go of the belief that they'd all find their way back to each other. The walls, usually filled with echoes of solitude, were now full of warmth, holding on to the kind of love that anchored them all. Winter came and went, bringing with it a softness that settled over Willow Creek. Victoria and her siblings took turns visiting their father at the modest house that had become the center of their shared days. He remained strong in spirit, even as his body showed signs of slowing down. Mornings were spent sharing quiet cups of coffee, afternoons filled with card games where he would laugh and accuse Sam of shuffling the deck unfairly. And the nights, those belonged to long talks that lingered until they were too drowsy to speak. "Do you remember when Mom used to make us stay up to watch the meteor showers?" Victoria asked one evening, glancing at her father. His eyes, now lined with years of life, lit up with the memory. "She always said the stars were proof that there's beauty in waiting," he replied, voice steady but faint. As the months passed, Victoria found herself memorizing these moments, wrapping each memory around her like a warm coat against the coming cold. Her siblings did the same, filling the house with noise and affection, determined to cherish every minute. But life, as it always does, moved in its quiet, inevitable way. One evening, with the scent of cinnamon tea hanging in the air and Emma reading softly from an old storybook, their father closed his eyes for the last time. He left them as he had lived, with a quiet strength, surrounded by love. Grief came in waves, washing over them when they least expected it. The first few weeks were hard, marked by shared silences and the ache of absence. Yet, woven into the sadness was the solace of knowing that they had not let those final months slip away unnoticed. The day of the memorial was crisp and clear, the kind of day their mother would have called perfect for new beginnings. The community gathered, a testament to the man who had once stood on the edges but never forgotten the core of his heart, his family. Victoria stood at the front, hands trembling slightly as she unfolded an old journal entry of her mother's, its pages marked with her looping handwriting. "Forgiveness is the root of strength, and in each shared smile, there's a chance to begin again." The words echoed in the small space, settling like a gentle weight in every heart. Tears shimmered but were met with soft smiles, the kind that spoke of understanding and unity. Victoria's voice caught as she looked at her siblings, who nodded in support, eyes brimming with emotion. The room seemed smaller, bound not by walls, but by the shared heartbeat of those gathered there. In the days that followed, Victoria turned her focus to the community center project. It became a labor of love, not just hers, but one embraced by her siblings. Emma curated art projects to decorate the walls, filling the space with the bright laughter of local kids. Sam, ever the organizer, coordinated fundraisers with the town, and even Alex, with his practical mind, ensured they stayed on budget, his wit keeping spirits high during late nights of planning. The community center came together piece by piece, a new wing dedicated to their parents that held family photos, their mothers' handwritten recipes, and letters that spoke of strength, love, and forgiveness. When it finally opened, the room was filled with voices that blended into one, a tapestry of stories, laughter, and a sense of belonging. A year later, the house Victoria once viewed as her fortress of solitude became a place full of life. Thanksgiving at her mansion was different now. The grand dining room, once reserved for the city's elite, was filled with family, neighbors, and friends. Kids darted between legs, their laughter bubbling over the hum of conversation, and the clink of simple dishes replaced the once sterile silence. Emma stood by the fireplace, balancing a tray of homemade rolls that everyone knew she'd burned slightly, but no one mentioned. Sam was wrestling with a giggling toddler who had stolen a spoon, and Alex, apron tied over his shirt, stirred gravy with mock concentration, pretending he was a five-star chef. Victoria paused, taking in the scene, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and peace. The house, once echoing only her footsteps, now held the weight of shared memories, simple joys, and the legacy of resilience passed down from their parents. "All right, everyone," Sam called, waving his arms. "Before we dig in, who's got a toast ready? And no, Alex, I don't mean a slice of bread," he added with a grin. Alex raised his hands, feigning innocence. "I'm hurt you'd even think that," he said, laughter following. Victoria stepped forward, glass in hand. The room quieted, the only sound the crackle of the fireplace. She looked at the faces around her, old and new, each one tied to the others by the invisible thread of love that had endured. "To family," she said, voice clear and steady. "To old memories and new ones, to holding tight to what matters and finding joy in every little thing." The clink of glasses and echoing cheers filled the room, warmth seeping into every corner. As the evening unfolded, Victoria's eyes drifted to the framed photo by the mantel, a picture of her parents, side by side, their smiles unguarded, full of hope. It was as if they were part of the gathering, watching over them with quiet pride. And when Victoria stepped outside to look up at the sky, the stars shimmered above, silent witnesses to a love that spanned beyond time, rooting her in the place she now called home.